Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
I hope the week has gone well for everyone. Welcome to a special Thursday night edition of Nightlight Part 2. Ken Quiethawk's introduction is a perfect setup for tonight's show. Our distinguished and returning guest is here, and I'm looking forward to kicking back and eating some Pop Rocks and drinking soda and learning about folklore from Dr. ALLAN HUNTer. I know those old friends are cheering me on to consume it, and there are a couple mermaids, one red dragon rider, and one human billboard saying, no, don't consume that stuff, Mark. But why did many of the listeners automatically know what I'm talking about? Why did those under 45 even know what I'm referencing? Probably you need to be closer to 50. But why do such legends persist? Are they based on fact? Many literary masterpieces and songs are based on folklore and stories passed down from generation to generation. You can listen to Led Zeppelin's Gallows Pole. It's just a traditional folk song. Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream uses the juice of a pansy to create an aphrodisiac to get the story started, and throughout the rest of the play, all types of flower imagery are used. What cultural and therapeutic significance did the flowers hold to the Elizabethans, and where did they derive their information? Sir Walter Scott collected folklore in the Scottish borders and said he met David Ritchie, and the protagonist of his novel The Black Dwarf. Washington Irving incorporated folklore in many of his popular tales, like The Guest from Gibbet Island. When Mike Bastine and Mason Winfield were our guests, like one of the first shows we did, and they were covering the New York Iroquois and the stories about them using stone canoes to paddle across Lake Erie to arrive along the western shores of New York. You get the other native legends about giants, and Rob Sullivan talks about the demiurge from Jewish folklore. The Wizard of Oz was to be an American folk tale, but the Grimm Brothers collection of about 200 fairy tales is the holy grail of folklore collections. And there was a recent cable show that modernized these tales. So why do they linger in our memories? What cultural value do they serve? So we have Dr. Allan G. Hunter returning for the third time to help us understand what we can learn from folklore with a special emphasis on the Grimm Brothers. He's the author of the fascinating Princes, Frogs, and Ugly Sisters, which which was recently published by Intertraditions and can be found on intertraditions.com and Amazon. Allan has had a career working with troubled youths as well as being a professor of literature at Curry College, and continues to write books that we're glad to review on Nightlight. Hi, Allan. How are you?
Oh, very happy to hear your voice and very happy to be here, Mark.
Okay. Well, hopefully that's not going to change over the next 2 hours. but I really enjoyed Princes, Frogs, and Ugly Sisters. Really neat book. It's the rather lengthy introduction. You can tell I like stuff like that, and I have like a couple more ideas I want to develop as we go along. But the Grimm Brothers do present some interesting stories. They're different from the Disney versions. But before we get into talking about their work, you do mention early on in your book that you also have some doubts about Shakespeare, and we've covered that topic a few times with about 3 people involved in the Shakespeare authorship controversy. What's your? We don't have to go into a lot of detail. You just also believe that have we been attributing this great body of plays and poems, sonnets to the wrong person? Was it a group of authors? Is it just the 17th Earl of Oxford? What's your professional view of this? I just wanted to add just a little bit more information to what we've already been covering.
Well, it's a really, really good question. I mean, Shakespeare was, to roll this back, he was a real person. We have enough evidence to know that he was a real person. His contemporaries wrote about him. So whoever he was a very unusual person. And I think one of the things that we get hung up on is, who wrote fill in the blank. And what we may want to consider is that Shakespeare was whoever Shakespeare was, and I believe there was a man called William Shakespeare, and he wasn't the 17th Earl of Oxford, but I'll get into that in a moment. He was a man who started off as an actor as well as a writer, and so like screenwriters of today, he would know all of the actors because they were all members of the company. They paid to join the company. He would know these actors, and he would say, who would make a really good hero of this kind? Who would make a good Julius Caesar? And so he would write the pieces as modern scriptwriters do today. They write a movie for a certain actor or a certain actress. They say, we have to have this person. And then if it didn't work, then they would rewrite it with the actor or with another scriptwriter. And that happens today because when you see a movie, There's always, script by, and if you know Hollywood at all, which I dabbled in some Hollywood script writing stuff myself, you know that script has gone through, 5, 6, 7 hands. And so to have one person's name attached to it is perhaps erroneous. And then, of course, you have the very real problem of how many plays just got lost, because we know that many of them got lost. And how were they put together? But if we return to the idea of, it has to be a nobleman who the 17th Earl of Oxford or whomsoever who wrote these plays, I think we paint ourselves into a corner, because most of the playwrights of that era, people that Shakespeare would have known, would have been familiar with, and definitely collaborated with, Beaumont and Fletcher, Ben Jonson. He knew these people. He drank with these people. They were always picking each other's brains like musicians today. They were always stealing a good tune and reworking it. Of course they were. They were professionals. They were trying to make a living. So these, such a person would have been very, very hampered in being able to mix with the more ordinary kinds of folks if he had been a nobleman, because we can't really conceive of what a nobleman was like in the 17th century, but a nobleman had the power of life and death over all the people who lived within his territory. I mean, he was insanely powerful if he chose to be so. He was judge, jury, and executioner. And that sort of mindset is very, very hard to match up with someone like Shakespeare, who seems more to have been like a sponge, taking references from everywhere. Now, you mentioned just a moment ago, you said Midsummer Night's Dream, which is actually one of the very, very few plays that we know of. There are only 2 that we know of that had no direct source, Midsummer Night's Dream and Tempest. Okay, all the others, Shakespeare stole the plot from well-known sources. It's been, attested again and again. But within Midsummer Night's Dream, we have all these references to flowers and their medicinal qualities and, their ability to charm. This was folklore, and noblemen tended not to get much folklore. People like Shakespeare, if I'm right in thinking that he really was the son of a glover in Stratford who went broke and had to hide from the church authorities, all terribly well documented. If he really was that man, he would have known the woods and the trees and the medicinal qualities of flowers. He'd have been in the kitchen knowing these things, because that was how you got your medicine in those days. And so what I'd like to do is, whoever we believe Shakespeare might be, and I don't want to offend anybody, but we have to believe not that he was this person or that person, but that he was this extraordinary polymath who was interested in just about everything that you could possibly be interested in the 17th century. He knew all about agriculture. He knew all about the flowers and the trees and the terms that were used for them in Warwickshire, which is, of course, where he was growing up, as well as elsewhere. And, he was trying to make a living using what he'd got. And to do that, he needed folk tales, he needed fairy tales, he needed familiar tales. So that sometimes people, I'm sure, would turn up at the theater and say, this is all about the Romans. We know a little something about the Romans. Let's find out more. And so you had the Roman cycle, or you had the history cycle of King Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2, Richard II, etc., etc. He was using folk tales in order to create a manageable sense of history. And history tells us where we are and how things are. his history was all stolen from various chronicles. Holinshed's Chronicles was one of the major sources, and he wasn't interested in being totally accurate. He was interested in giving us some wisdom about how the world works. So that's a very long answer to your question, Mark.
Yeah.
But there's some.
It's great. I just wanted your perspective, since that topic does come up every 6 months or so.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, it really is. And I told you I wanted to do this like little segment on Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century history of the kings of Britain, and our good friend Maria Wheatley, who's at Stonehenge about daily, said, you have to ask that a question. So so I'm going to send the archive to Maria tomorrow. Tomorrow when it's done. But if you read Geoffrey's chronicle of the building of Stonehenge, he says, many years ago the giants transported them, meaning the rocks, from the remotest confines of Africa and set them up in Ireland. We know that that's not accurate. The stones were quarried in Wales and transported to where they are now. But Geoffrey just mentions in that passage that giants moved them. Well, Aubrey Burrell's book, Stone Circles of British Isles, does talk about foreign occupiers of the Stonehenge area were much larger than the native English, like Neolithic people. So, okay, there's a little bit of truth. Okay, maybe they weren't giants, but they are a much larger race of people from the continent. The Africa to Ireland thing. It's actually kind of backwards. You get Newgrange is something like 500 years older than the Giza pyramids, but that megalithic engineering was perfected in Africa. So there's that connection. There's it's not perfectly accurate, but there's something to it. But one of the more interesting aspects of the building of Stonehenge is where Merlin is interacting with one of the king, and he said these stones are connected with certain sacred religious rites, and they have various properties which are medicinally important. And when Maria's been a guest with us, she's made the claim that Stonehenge was basically like used as a healing center. It was, a hospital. So, Geoffrey is writing about 700 years after Camelot. And, it's still a couple, 2,000-3,000 years after the Stonehenge was the whole complex was started. But if we just look at writing 700 years after he's setting his story, what is it about the accuracy that was passed on about, this is a healing center? I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But that's there's a kernel of truth to that whole section in Jeffrey's book.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I was just
going to say, it sets the stage for what, the truths that you're going to be talking about. Who are these wizard characters? Like, they seem to know something. And the Grimm brothers have a bunch of wizards. And
they certainly do,
So, but I just thought the Stonehenge thing was just a nice jumping off point. It might be a better analogy than the pop rocks, but
yeah. Well, it's a very good jumping off point because, as you say, legend grows up, and there is often a kernel of something really important in the legend that gets perhaps lost a little bit or distorted a little bit, and the time period gets a little changed around as well. I mean, modern archaeology supports some of the things that are being postulated, because Stonehenge is on this huge ceremonial plain, which includes Avebury, Durrington Walls, Woodhenge, and many other smaller monuments that we're only just discovering. I mean, on last month, on June 22nd, I think it was, the Smithsonian put out a report saying that all the way around Durrington Walls, which is just across the other side of the river from Stonehenge and was linked to it before they knocked the stones down, of course, that the archaeologists had found this series of pits completely circling Durrington Walls and about 1,000 paces from Durrington Walls. And these pits were not small pits. They were 15 feet deep, circular, 30 feet across, and perfectly cylindrical. Now, one says, "Gosh, you don't build or excavate pits like that in the Neolithic period unless this is a very special place." And it's clear that Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was writing, as you say, nearly 3,000 years after the first part of Stonehenge was put up, he knew that this was a really important ceremonial complex. He maybe wasn't quite sure which bits were which. There's at least one theory, folklore theory, that goes that Avebury Rings, which are just a few miles away, was a marriage ceremony place for our early ancestors, who actually were shorter than the people who came from the continent, since you mentioned that. And bear in mind that until the year 1920, well, actually 1900, if you were over 6 feet tall in England, you were officially a giant. Think of that. I mean, the average Englishman was about 5'4". So the idea of the giants doesn't necessarily mean somebody who's 90 feet tall. It means someone about 6 feet tall, which we regard as being pretty normal today. So this is where legend and nomenclature and how we describe things gets a little confused, I think, and delightfully so. So I'll give you one more example here, because we all know the story of the sword in the stone, right?
Right.
The sword has to be pulled out of the stone, and this is the person who will be the king of England. Wonderful. And we all know the story of Excalibur. The Lady of the Lake raises the sword out of her arm, appears in the middle of the lake, and King Arthur takes it, and then when he is on his last almost death bed, he throws it back into the lake, and it is reclaimed. And you think to yourself, well, what a strange story that is. And it's wonderfully romantic, and it's very moving. And there is a little kernel of something magical, at least it would have been magical to our ancestors, because swords in the very early days of metallurgy, so right at the start of the Iron Age, swords were a bit of a problem, because the iron ore was not very pure, and so you could make a sword that looked good, but it was in great danger of shattering. Or you could make a sword that looked good, but was in great danger of bending. So for a long time, the metallurgists, and believe me, every village had somebody who was making something out of copper, out of silver, out of gold, or out of iron. The metallurgists, this is an archaeological theory that has been floated a few years ago. The metallurgists discovered that if you took iron ore and heated it and then poured it into a mold, which was difficult to create because molds would break unless you carved them in rock. And we have some of these. So the molten metal was poured into rock-like outlines of a sword blade with a place to grasp it at the end. And then, of course, you had a basic sword, but it was going to be fairly impure iron, and it had to be worked. And that meant you had to heat it and hammer it, and wait for it, you had to plunge it into cold water to temper it. The Lady in the Lake, putting the sword in the lake in order to cause the iron to cool quickly so that you got a strong sword that could also be sharpened. And, when you look at it in those terms, you realize that rumbling through the background was what would have been regarded by the average Iron Age citizen. They would have said, it's a miracle, we melt these stones and they turn to liquid, and then it becomes this hard, iron, sharp thing, magic, Merlin's magic. Well, maybe the first metallurgists felt like Merlin to them. But when you look at the folklore in this way, you see, oh my goodness, there are human tales, and rumbling below them, there are other tales which are ancient and have to do with wonder at how things in the world worked. So there's a long disquisition there, going off at a bit of a tangent, but I'm trying here to suggest that when we listen to folk tales, sometimes there is something unexpected in there that we go, wow, that is really what those people in that time and period would have been fascinated by, that today just completely bypasses us.
Okay, I really enjoyed that explanation. That was a couple really neat segues away from your book, and I think the audience had to get something out of your discussion, and so let's kind of move it into your the insights that you provide in your book, and with the loyal audience that Barbara's built up over the last 11 years, or might be considered pilgrims. Looking for the truth. And if we, you do analyze the Cinderella story, and we can look at her going to the ball over the three evenings, and you say that's a pilgrimage for her. It's not like big. A pilgrimage doesn't have to be a huge undertaking like the going the 60 miles from the Tabard Inn to the Canterbury Cathedral. It could just be this walking down the block for Cinderella from the house and her the little a tree outside their house to where the weekend festivities were held. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of the pilgrimage or pilgrim archetype character?
Yes. Well, that's a really wonderful question, because I think you're right. I mean, the pilgrim archetype is the one who questions, who is looking for answers beyond the usual answers. And, that's your listeners. Those are the people that you and Barbara have been working with. I mean, I think working with is the best description I can think of, because, you are there asking people to ask questions of themselves. This is the pilgrim archetype. Now, as you say, you don't have to go from London to Canterbury, or from London to Jerusalem, or from London to Mecca. But you do have to get out of your comfort zone in order to be a pilgrim. You do and that's what Cinderella does. I mean, she's basically sitting by the fire, kind of imprisoned. They won't let her go to the ball. She keeps saying, how about if I sort out, if I do something? And Mother says, sort out these peas and lentils. And she does it with the help of birds. And then she says, no, you still can't go. And she does it 3 times. She gets 3 refusals. And the mother says, well, you don't have a dress to wear, so you can't go. A lesser person would just say, oh, well, I guess I can't go. But for Cinderella, she says, I'm not going to let these people stop me. And she goes to the ball. She does it not just once, she does it 3 times. So it's not just, let's see if I can break the rules once. It's, I am going to break the rules because I know I have to meet my destiny. And that's what a pilgrim is. Someone who says, I'm not going to stay in this safe, cozy place. I have something to find out. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to find out. And of course, those are the people who tend to make their parents very anxious. And they're the ones that tend to have aunts and uncles go, oh no, she is 29 and not married, not settled down, oh no. And the pilgrim says, well, I've got a few things to do first. Please stand aside. But the pilgrim is above all a spiritual and intellectual seeker after what he or she feels is true. And actually, in history, if we think of the pilgrims who went to Jerusalem, and the pilgrims who still today go on the Camino to the Church of Santiago de Compostela, which is in Spain. Actually, every year, hundreds of thousands of people walk across Europe, or sometimes they walk only part of the way, to get to this church in Spain. And it's not about seeing the architecture, although the architecture is beautiful. It's about the process of what happens to you if you carry your possessions on your back in a little bag, and you spend 3 weeks walking across Europe, mostly across fields. There are no easy ways of doing it. Through the Pyrenees sometimes. I mean, occasionally people freeze to death in the Pyrenees. What does it do to you? What does it take in order to go on that pilgrimage? And actually, it's a spiritual pilgrimage. People reach the church, and they may not be able to put into words what it is they've learned or what it is they've discovered, but actually if you meet them and you talk to them, you feel there's a depth of something really important, humanly important, that they have met themselves somehow. And that was the idea. That was why, that was why pilgrim routes were so popular in the medieval period, because people knew that you could uncover something that you couldn't uncover if you stayed at home. When I lived in England, because I was, of course, born in England, there was a lovely little church just up the road from me, and the pillars of the church had graffiti cut into them. And the most common graffito there was a cross, a little cross, and apparently this was what the medieval, mostly young men, would do when they, just before they went off on their pilgrimage, or later the Crusades, they would take their knife or their sword, and because they had to do an all-night vigil, not go to sleep, but be sitting on the altar or kneeling on the altar steps, praying for God to enlighten them, they would stay awake by carving with the edge of their swords, which they took in with them to be blessed, into these series of pillars, these little crosses. And you look at them, they're there today. Compton is the name of the village. And the marks are there, and they've been there for, 700 years. But they knew that they had to, as it were, purify themselves first before taking on this great adventure. And all good folk tales and all good fairy tales are an invitation to the main protagonist to go on a pilgrimage, to leave home in some sense, and take the risks involved in telling one's truth. Every single one of the folk tales that is a real story as opposed to just an anecdote is about somebody leaving home. Again and again, the Grimm Brothers describe this to us. And because it's when you're on the road that you learn stuff. Staying at home, it all becomes rather theoretical. So the pilgrim is a major archetype.
Okay, and when you're on the road, frequently you get lost in the woods.
Yes.
But that's another interesting metaphor that is presented in the tale, and you bring that up as well. Can you talk a little bit about that site? And it's actually a good experience to get lost in the woods at some point.
Yes, it is. It can be a little scary too. And that's okay, because we have to learn to be with fear. That's one of the great human lessons. We have to learn to cope with fear and to realize it's just fear. But yes, you're absolutely right there. In many of the tales that I can think of, and I'm thinking of the little tailor, Hans the Hedgehog, Hans my Hedgehog, really, and the three brothers, etc., etc. For many of these, what happens is, in the Grimm Brothers tales, is that this figure takes off, he leaves home, and one of the first things that happens is he goes into a dark forest, and he gets pretty much lost. But the idea is that in a dark forest you lose yourself, but you also find your spiritual self. Now, it's hard for us to think of getting lost in a forest, perhaps today, because we have our GPS and we have maps and all the rest of it. But in the year 1800, Europe, most of Europe was covered in forests still, in places where today there are none. And they were dense forests, and people did get lost, and robbers did live there, and bears and all the rest of it. And sometimes people took a long time to find their way out. The famous example that I I love actually is that when Napoleon was fighting the Battle of Salamanca, which I think was something like 1806, okay, he won because half of the troops, I think the German troops, got lost in the forest and they couldn't find the battle. You know, when you think of a Napoleonic battle, the noise, etc., must have been tremendous. But half the troops couldn't find where to get to because they were still lost in the forest. And so Napoleon won that one. If you go to Salamanca today, you will not see a forest. It just isn't there. But to return to the tales, it's a very good metaphor for needing to lose your direction in order to find it again. And it's a very old image. In the Grail legends, of course, Joseph Campbell speaks eloquently about this, but one of the things that happens in the Grail legends is that the knights are gathered, knights of the Round Table are gathered, and they say, you know, we need to go on a quest. And so that's the moment when the Holy Grail appears, and they all decide to go on a quest. And the line that fascinates me is the next morning, it says, they got up and they all rode out to the large forest, and each one entered the forest at the place that seemed to him best. So nobody is going down a beaten path. They're making their own way through the forest. And they know they'll get lost, and they know they'll meet people, and some of them will be friendly and some of them won't. That's the essence of the pilgrim archetype. So when you have, you know, your relative who says, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, but I feel I have to do this now. Our tendency is to say, oh, don't do that, you know, there's no money in it, you know, there's no security in it. But if we know about the archetypes, the 6 archetypes of human development that I outline in my book, we can say, oh, here's somebody who's entering the pilgrim phase. Stand back, because this person has to do it his or her way. Don't try and say, go to law school, it'll pay better. Don't try to say, do something safe. You have to let people take their own way. Now, this is a fundamental psychological truth about mental health. The people who I find in my counseling practice, again and again, who are most confused are those who have not been allowed to take their own way. Their parents or their family has said, oh no, you really don't want to do that, you must do this. You must join the family firm. You must, and they come out at the end of a couple of years and they say, I don't like it. I don't want to do it. I don't know what I want to do, but it's not this. And my work with my counseling clients is often to just say, you know what? What you're doing is really healthy. You need to find your path, not someone else's path. So this is just a terribly important stage in the psyche's development, and it's been with us since, well, forever, because in every tale you can think of, certainly every tale I can think of, every cycle of tales, the young hero or female heroine has to go off into the wilderness, has to go off someplace that is not safe and brave it. It's even in the Jesus story in the Bible, if you want. I mean, Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. That's an awful long time not to have food. And in that time, he's tempted by the devil, we're told. And whether you are a believer in Christianity or not, it doesn't stop us looking at this as a human tale that says, when you go off on your own to find yourself, there will be temptations. There will be temptations just as Jesus faced them, temptations of food, of glory, of believing yourself special, power. Yes, absolutely. The devil says, I'll give you all this world if you'll just bow down and worship me. And Jesus says, I'm on my path. No, get thee behind me, Satan, he says. Now, that's probably an example that most people in our culture know, and if we just know the story and say, it's that Christian story thing, we miss the point that this is a story that was very, very effective in reminding people of their own psychic and spiritual needs. Namely, we have to find our own path, and we have to fight for our own path. So that's the Pilgrim archetype.
And you give us page 153, where you do use that falling asleep metaphor for like just it's not that you're lazy. Some of the characters are just processing their own internal world and where they want to go. Similar to what you were saying, with the Pilgrim, making your own path.
Yeah. Well, yes, sleep as a metaphor, of course, is wonderful, because sleep is the letting go of what is in order to just be asleep. And characters in the Grimm Brothers' tales, and this is why I wrote about these tales in such specificity and so much detail, because they are psychologically absolutely accurate. Characters are tempted with sleep and sometimes go to sleep and sometimes allow themselves to go to sleep as part of a psychic process of letting go of the past. So in one tale I can think of, the young prince has to sit guard over a series of princesses, and the challenge is that at various times in the night, someone will come along and say, "Are you asleep? Are you asleep?" But luckily the princesses have all clubbed together and arranged for a reply to be given so that he can get his sleep, so that he can be renewed. So they're working on his side against authoritarian demands that he should stay awake. A little later in the same story, the youngest princess takes him under her wing, and when he's set difficult tasks like clear this entire forest by morning, here is a glass axe, he can't do it. And he says to her, that's it, I give up. I absolutely give up. They're just going to have to kill me. And the youngest princess says, "Don't worry, just lie down," and she soothes him and says, "Go to sleep." And the moment he's asleep, she calls up this army of elves who do the task for him. And then a bit later, he wakes up, says it's all been done. He never asks her. He says, "Well, how did you do that? What happened? What's going on?" He never asks her. He just accepts that when he's with this woman, magical things happen. And to question them really isn't part of understanding. And if we translate that into real terms, think of it this way. When you're with someone who really is your significant other, your other half, your soulmate, when you're with that person, magical things happen. Things that had seemed impossible sometimes just happen. And to then turn around and say, "Well, how did that happen? I don't understand. What's going on? That's not the laws of physics." that sort of gets in the way. What happens in the story, and it happens 3 times that the princess saves him from death, basically, by having the little earth men, they're called, change the landscape. What happens is that he recognizes on his own he can't do something. But with her, with them working together as a team, they certainly can move mountains and make things happen. I think that's beautiful. I think that really is beautiful. You know, when you see young people who are choosing their life partners, choosing their mates, sometimes you see that they can't quite get anything to work. And sometimes you see that they sort of effortlessly go at life with courage, and things sort of unfold for them, almost as though doors are flung open in the most unexpected way. And you think, wow, I don't know what it is they've got, but they've got something. And that's what this particular Grimm Brothers tale is suggesting. And I could go into a great deal. It's a very long tale, actually, because they then have to escape, and they work out a more, shall I say, equal relationship. So as they're running away, she says, "Oh no, my father's coming! Quick, quick! How can I hide?" And he says, "I don't know." She says, "I'll turn myself into a fish, and you will turn yourself into a lake." You think of that. She's the fish, the moving, living creature, but he is what allows it to live. And the king comes along, he can't see anything. He goes home. And the next time, I mean, there are variants of this story that's fascinating. This element recurs. And the next time the king comes back, and she turns herself into a rose, and he turns himself into the thorny bush that protects it. Again, you know, the beautiful thing protected. And the king comes along and says, I can't see anything. And then on another occasion, this time the queen says, "Oh, the king, he doesn't get it." So she goes off after the escaping couple, and the young princess says, "Quick, quick," to the young man. She says, "Turn yourself into a church, and I'll turn myself into the priest." So, you know, the two can't exist. A priest without a church isn't really a priest. A fish without a lake isn't really going to last very long. A rose without its support can't. And you get the sense from this tale, this folk tale, that of course it's not realistic, but psychologically it might be incredibly accurate. When two people are working well together, they support each other in this way. They need each other in this way, and that's when the magic, if we want to call it, happens. That's when what seemed impossible just unfolds naturally in front of everybody, and people go, "Oh, okay, well, I guess they..." and we don't quite know what to make of it. But we all know bad relationships. We've all seen those. You know, film stars seem to do it a lot. I think because they're not looking at the inner person so much often as, you know, the publicity or the glamorous outer person. So these folk tales that I like to focus on always have a deeper meaning beyond the literal meaning. They have yeah.
Oh, I go ahead and finish your thought.
Well, I basically was going to say that if we look at the literal meaning, then we do what we've done for the last 100 years, which is where we say, "Oh, it can't be true. It's fantasy. It's silly. It's for kids." And suddenly, we throw away a huge amount of very deep psychological awareness about how people operate and need to operate. You know, they're just for children. It's Disney tales. It's nonsense. It's something we play to the little children on Saturdays when they're bored. Well, that's a terrible thing to do with a story that actually, if one takes the trouble to understand it, has some deep psychological resonances that Lord knows, we all could benefit from in our troubled times.
Well, and you, Hansel and Gretel, and some of these other stories might have references to certain behaviors that there's a term for it today, but the Grimm Brothers, were talking about discussing the symptoms, sometimes of post-traumatic stress disorder, or the overly strict parents. What you just mentioned a few minutes ago about authoritarian figures. They also covered, or you talked, wrote about real physical symptoms such as postnatal depression.
Yes.
And so the Grimm Brothers are talking about real illnesses that were present in 1812 when the book came out. And I'm sure you deal with that with some of your clients. So what are these? Since we're talking about the real truths of human behavior, what do some of these parents represent? Some of them are portrayed very terribly.
Yes. Well, parents appear in these stories a great deal, obviously, and sometimes step-parents. And the wicked stepmother and the callous stepfather and folks like that. It's not too huge a step to realize that, of course, in the year 1800, a lot of people, parents, died. Many of them died in childbirth. Women died in childbirth. If you made it to 40, you were doing okay. So there were quite a few orphans out there in the world, and they experienced some sort of care, but probably not the best care, because they were unlikely to inherit anything. So there were lots of orphans, like Cinderella. Her mother dies, like Sleeping Beauty, actually. We could keep adding to the list here quite easily and find that there are quite a lot of motherless and sometimes fatherless children. Hansel and Gretel are, they're basically sent out into the woods. There's the forest again. They're sent out into the forest to die, and that's when they meet the witch. So in terms of tale telling, and indeed in terms of psychological damage today, it's often very hard for people to say, my biological parent was not a good parent, or to say things like, I hate what my father, mother did to me in my life. It's very hard for people to say that. But it's much easier if you can say in a story that here is a step-parent who did this, because it takes the anger that the child feels and the disappointment and the utter despair that the child feels and displaces it onto somebody else. So that psychologically, that is very, very useful, to be able to tell a story and tell it so that it is acceptable to one's own ears, my step-parent, etc., rather than saying, actually, my mother never cared for me, which is that's a hard one for anybody to utter, let alone face. So there are lots and lots of step-parents, which corresponded quite nicely to the situation then. Strangely enough, it corresponds to the situation now, because there are a lot of divorces, and there are a lot of blended families and parents who are biologically, fathers or mothers, but who drift out of the familial circle, and there's great pain attached to that. Sometimes it's hard for people to get to that pain because it's the pain of something missing, a father who wasn't there. It's hard to assess what you missed. You can see what other people might have had, but it's very hard to pin that down. So these stories are very, very good at articulating what was a family dynamic then, and actually is a family dynamic now. So when Hansel and Gretel are abandoned in the woods, they would have every right to say, good grief, my parents really didn't care for me very much. That's hard for a young child to acknowledge, instead of which in the story they meet the witch, and the witch has the food that they crave. And that's why they were abandoned in the woods, because there was nothing to feed them on. The witch has the food, but she enslaves them both and is going to eat Hansel, going to consume him, going to cook him. She winds up, of course, in the oven herself. But this dramatizes the whole problem that must have existed for many, many children then, and exists for quite a lot of children now, which is there any story out there that mirrors my experience of not being wanted? And can I triumph over the people like the witch, who aren't really witches, of course, they just seem that way to the child, the witch who gives me food but wants to control me, wants to devour me, wants me to be something I can't be. And so these stories articulate the neuroses of that time and of many other times, and actually of our time too. So we do well to pay attention to these stories and say, yes, there is some depth to this. There is something very important that's happening. I'll give you another example of that, if you like. Well, there are so many examples there, but this is a pretty good one. It's called The Girl Without Hands. And in the course of the story, she has her hands chopped off. That's why it's called that. And she is the daughter of a miller. And the miller is walking home one day, and the devil says to him, I'll give you everything you want. You just have to give me the first thing you see when you come home. And the miller is a greedy fellow, says, okay. And he walks home, and of course the first thing he sees is his daughter. And he says to her, well, I have to give you to the devil. And she says, okay, you're my father, I must do what you say, but first of all, I need to wash myself thoroughly. And so she washes herself thoroughly, and the devil comes the next day and says, I can't take her, she's too clean. And so the miller says, well, you can't wash yourself then. And she says, okay, I can't wash myself. Instead of which she cries, and her tears wash her clean. And the devil comes along again, she's still too clean, we've got to stop her. And then the miller says, well, there's only one way I can do that, and that's to cut her hands off. And the devil says, well, you better do that. Ghastly stuff. And all the time, the miller doesn't say, I made a mistake, devil, you better take me. You leave my daughter out of it. He just regards his daughter as somebody who can be sacrificed for his physical well-being. And you think to yourself, well, okay, except, of course, that in many households at around that time, and in many parts of the world to this day, daughters are sacrificed in marriages that bring wealth to the father. To this day, that happens. Daughters are married off so that fathers can gain money, position, etc., etc. in some countries, and to a lesser extent, actually, in our own country, where people are only too keen to set up marriages for their daughters that benefit themselves. I won't give any examples because I think you can imagine that they are out there. So the actual situation was an important one. What does a young woman do when her father's intent on giving her away in order to get money? And the answer in that particular tale is really interesting, because what she does is she resists doing anything frantic. She doesn't try to kill her father or run off or whatever. She just says, okay, I can't do anything except maintain my innocence. And that's exactly what she does. She goes off into the world without hands, and because she is so helpless, the story tells us, she's actually attended on by angels. And you think, wow, this is a sort of saintly tale. But think of it. What happens if you go out into the world helpless and just ask the world to provide? Actually, what tends to happen is you meet angels in human form. You meet people who say, oh my God, you need some help. Let me help you. Right. And that's exactly what happens in the story. Now, she does have a few more trials along the way, including a mother-in-law who doesn't like her. But she goes forward into the world in utter faith that the world will provide for her, and that actually is heroic. She doesn't fret, she doesn't fuss, she doesn't flutter, she just goes into the world. And by the end of the story, she does get her hands back, and she does find her husband again, and everything is put back in order. But it's a story of courage. What do you do when you have no clout in the world? Well, you behave with dignity, with restraint, with courage, and the world provides. It's a marvelous tale, actually. Not realistic, and yet inspirational.
Yeah, and there are a number of other stories. Since we're talking about children, Hansel and Gretel, or they seem like they're twins. And then you get the one-eye, two-eye, three-eye story with looking at the birth order of the children, and you get like Cinderella would fall into that too, and she's also like this, the stepdaughter, kind of swept off to the side there and ignored most of the time. But as you look at the effects of birth order on the characters and some of the tales, can you tell us that importance, and then we can kind of work in a little segue into how Frank's research supports what the Grimm brothers wrote about 200 years earlier.
Yeah. Well, again, very good question. It's Frank Fullaway, of course, is the researcher who looked at birth order, Harvard trained, and he noted some characteristics of birth order that, in fact, the Grimm brothers were very, very astute to recognize. You mentioned the story of one-eyed, two-eyed, three-eye. The eldest is one eye because she has one eye. The middle child is 2 eyes, normal in terms of number of eyes. And the last child is 3 eyes, who has 3 eyes, 2 in the usual place and 1 in the middle of her head. And like all middle children, middle children are sort of caught in the sandwich and sometimes not treated terribly well. Sometimes, not always. And this is a quintessential story of a middle child who is not treated very well. She's not given enough food again, and she goes out into the world and is met by a wise woman who enables her to get enough to eat. She recites a rhyme, and a table appears full of food, which she then can spirit away. And of course, this makes the other sisters terribly jealous, and so they plot against her, and they kill her goat, her magic goat, thinking, well, now she won't be able to get those meals that we've been envying so much. And you think, what a dumb thing to do. Why didn't they just say, hey, can we eat with you? Because you're obviously getting some good food from this magical rhyme that you tell over your goat. But because they're so caught up in anger, the eldest child and the youngest child, who sort of get in league together, bully the middle child. Parents, I know, will identify with this from time to time. And what they do is, by bullying the middle child, they actually do something that is destructive not just to the middle child, but to everybody. Well, the story continues, as I'm sure you know. The goat is killed, and the middle child, 2 eyes, asks for its entrails and buries them by the door, because that's what she's been told to do by this magical woman who appears. And this wonderful tree grows up. Gold and silver tree with gold fruit on it, and you think, well, that's interesting. But nobody can get at the fruit except her. The branches won't bend towards 1 eye or 3 eyes; they only go to 2 eyes. And you think to yourself, here's a metaphor. What is it we plant that grows into fruit? Our goodwill is what we plant that grows into fruit. And no matter how well we do, those people who envied us, even if they're family members, those people who envied us won't like what we do, and they won't like how we live. And that's exactly what happens to the older sister and the youngest sister. They are consumed with just envy and rage. However, 2 eyes manages to meet a knight who asks her to get the fruit, and she's the only one who can get the fruit. And then he says, well, I think you should come away with me. And he does, and the tree magically follows her to her new abode where she marries the knight. And you think, well, this is a very strange tale because people have too many eyes. But then think of it symbolically. If you've got 1 eye, you see things only from one point of view. If you've got 3 eyes, maybe you see too much. But if you've got God's sort of, or the normal, I hate to use the word normal, but the usual number of eyes, 2, you see things in a balanced way. And so what the story is telling us in a roundabout way is that this middle child might just be the one who can see things in a more balanced way. Now, Frank Soloway, the researcher, suggested very strongly that the firstborn is usually the one who follows in the family footsteps, the eldest child. The thirdborn tries to fit in wherever he or she can. It's the secondborn that is the peacemaker, and that's exactly what we see in this story. The peacemaker who has a difficult time and in the end has to get out, because sometimes you can't make peace with people. And that's just one example of birth order. A recurrent example with the Grimm Brothers' tales is usually with the youngest child, who is often a boy, who is lorded over by the two elder children. And often the youngest child, sometimes there are three elder children, but the youngest child is often called simpleton or dummling or stupid or any variety of that, because in a family the youngest child is often, by being the youngest, all the others are able to do things that the youngest child can't do. So sometimes in not very friendly families, the youngest child is thought of as being stupid or somehow not very able. But in all of these stories, and I'm thinking of the Three Feathers, in all of these stories, the Three Feathers particularly, a task is set, and the eldest son doesn't really care if he does it properly or not, and he's usually in league with the second son, who similarly doesn't really care. And the last child, the simpleton, sits down and says, I don't know how to do this. This is a really difficult task. And that is usually when he gets some sort of message or discovers a trap door in front of his feet that leads down into the earth. In the Three Feathers, the young man doesn't know what to do, so he goes down into the depths of the earth, and there he meets actually a large toad. And you think, well, that's not very nice, is it? But he just doesn't run away. He says, I don't know what to do. I've been set a task by my father, and I'm sure my brothers are going to do better. And the first task is find the most beautiful ring in the world. And the toad there in this deep pit says, don't worry, I'll sort it. Take this, and hands him a beautiful ring. And the simpleton goes to the surface and presents it to his father, and yes, it is indeed the simplest, the most beautiful ring, and the other brothers haven't really tried. They bring back plain iron rings from a wagon. And so it goes with all the three tests, because 3 times this test is levied, and each time the older brothers say, no, that wasn't fair, They're trying to cheat the youngest out of his reward. And you say to yourself, so what is the symbolic, the spiritual, the psychological value of this? And the psychological value, it seems to me, is pretty strong in most of these tales that have this trope within them, this literary way of looking at things. And that is, if you're the youngest and you think you don't have to do things according to expectations or whatever, if you're in that place, you can be, in fact, a very, very powerful pilgrim. You have the ability to descend not just physically down the steps to where the toad lives, but to descend into yourself and say, what is it that I need to do here? And whatever it is you find will be the finest that is available. Now think of that for a second. Think of that, how we rush our children through college and we rush them into jobs, and we don't give them a moment to say, what's really true for me? What is the treasure I have within me? What is the treasure I have within me? That's the ring in the first test. A scarf or a shawl is the second test. And the third test is the most beautiful maiden in the world. How do I decide what is really, truly valuable? And the third-born child, because the expectations are relaxed, after all, nobody thinks he's going to do anything. They think he's stupid. The third-born child has the freedom to do what all of us need to do, which is to say, what works for me? What is true for me? And he does this with complete patience and complete composure. And of course, what we discover is that he's not stupid at all. He is just stupid in terms of how to get ahead in the world. His brothers know how to get ahead in the world. They cheat. Oh. That doesn't really do it for very long. So this is a major theme. Birth order is there to reflect certain things to us, and they are always about whether we have the freedom to go inside ourselves. So in Hans the Hedgehog, very famous story, Hans is the second, he's the first child, but he looks like a hedgehog, and he's rejected by his parents, and they call him stupid, just because he doesn't look like everybody else. He's half hedgehog, as the story suggests. And father says, "Go away, you're not my child anymore." Total rejection. Now, that happens to firstborns and secondborns and thirdborns, but it can happen to firstborns who aren't very fortunate. And guess what? He goes into the dark forest, and he discovers what he's really, really good at. He's really good at raising animals. And so when he comes out of the forest, he is ready to claim his life as he sees fit. And that means that during the course of the story, he helps a king, and the king says, when I get out of the forest, you can, of course, marry my daughter. And he, after various tribulations, he does do that. And this allows him finally to stop being Hans the Hedgehog. He's able to remove his hedgehog skin, because now he's with someone, the king's daughter, who is prepared to love him no matter what he looks like. And I have to say, it's a very moving tale. I've come across people who've been afraid that nobody will love them because they're not the same. Maybe are not the most attractive people in the world. And then they found someone who really loves them for who they are. And what emerges is, of course, the new person, the person who removes all the defenses, the hedgehog spikes of defense, and becomes beautiful. Maybe not physically different, but beautiful in attitude. So we have not just a whole series of stories that talk about birth order, but they are very flexible because they talk about the birth order and what happens if an eldest child isn't the finest creature on the block, because of course the eldest boy was going to be the heir, the son and heir. What happens if that child isn't? Well, that's Hans the Hedgehog. In The Boy Who Goes Forward to Learn About the Shivers, one of the very early tales in the sequence, he, the boy, is the second-born son, and the firstborn is father's pet and does everything according to convention. But he, the second-born, has a disability, one might say, that he doesn't realize as a disability. And the disability in The Boy Who Goes Forward to learn about the Shivers is he's never scared. He's never scared of anything. He's just not scared. It doesn't happen to him. And the family, of course, says, well, this isn't natural, this isn't right. And they cast him off. And yet he learns during the course of the story that courage is a wonderful thing, and he also learns when he finds the king's daughter, etc., that there is a time to be vulnerable. And the time to be vulnerable is when you love somebody. But he's a second son, Second sons, certainly in the England I grew up in, and before that, second sons were always thought of as being kind of superfluous. It was the first son who was going to get the money and the estate, and the second son, well, okay. It's right there in these stories. Frank Holloway's wonderful book, Born to Rebel, outlines exactly these family dynamics. But here were the Grimm brothers before the phrase family dynamics ever existed. And they said, look, this is what happens in families. And the listeners, sitting around the fire, listening to the folk story reciter telling these stories, would say, yeah, I know what it's like to be a second son who isn't regarded very well. I know what it's like to be called dumb, and I know I'm not dumb. I know what... And they would identify with this. And they would see within the exaggerations of the tale their own psychological and spiritual situation. And they would learn and be healed by that. And I want to stress this idea of healing, because when we see our story or hear our story being told and we identify with it and we say, I'm not alone. This is partly my story. When we see that, it gives us immense courage and a sense of liberation. We know if we're not alone, then, other people have survived this too. Let's learn how they survived. Let's learn how it happened for them. So, this is absolutely vital in terms of family dynamics. The Grimm Brothers tales, again and again, have to do with or illustrate situations, and you gave the situation of Cinderella. They illustrate situations which are family-centered and in which sometimes people need a little help to see clearly what's going on so that they don't feel ground down. I think these are terribly important things to be told to children.
I do too, and I just thought I was sitting there, reading your book, and I came across your reference to Frank Soloway's Born to Rebel book, and he did just a wonderful job of making that connection, and how all of Frank's graphs and all the charts in his book and all the research, it really does emphasize the importance that the Grimm brothers put on birth order. And you made that connection. I was like, oh wow, that's a fascinating point you made.
Oh, thank you. It really is. I mean, families. We all come from families, and whether we like it or not, we have we have a birth order which changes roughly who we are likely to be. I have grandchildren, and the eldest is 7, and the twins are 2, and the 7-year-old is perforce. She loves her twin sisters, and she looks after them, and so suddenly she is in a position of firstborn authority, and with authority, as it were, to care for and to some extent look after these 2 little tearaways. And that's going to shape her life experience forever. If she'd been an only child, she wouldn't have that experience. She might be roughly the same, but she would perhaps have a different attitude towards the rest of the world, and so on. And this is absolutely in tune with what Soloway says and observes so carefully, and it's totally in tune with the Grimm brothers. They get it.
You also, and in some of the other books on birth order, and I talk about, you can have 2 firstborn parents, and that's kind of a mismatch. What's the effect going to be on the children? Would the children be completely different if dad was the firstborn and mom was a latter born? child. The whole family dynamic is just a really interesting study, and there's like what's his name? His last name's Lehman. He has another interesting book on birth order, but Frank's book's really an excellent book, and I enjoyed having him on a show I did, 4 or 5 years ago. That there's also well, the thing is, some of these other archetypes that we see in literature and movies. One example was like John Fogerty's song "Old Man Down the Road," and he has references to cross-tie walkers. You get that creepy figure at the start of the Pardoner's Tale from the Canterbury Tales, where he tells the riders where they're going to find death, like the High Plains Drifter with Clint Eastwood.
Yeah.
You get some of these a lot of these characters seem like they're these solitary people walking through this barren landscape.
Yeah.
You really aren't sure if they're good or bad. Are they like Jesus in disguise or Satan in disguise? Like the Hitchhiker episode of The Twilight Zone. They're very ambiguous, but you get these characters where they're very wise. They know what's going on, but can you really trust them? And it's just really interesting to see how many of these archetypes that you bring up, just from the Grimm Brothers, that also are in a Clint Eastwood movie. He's with the High Plains Drifter. He's a minister, but he's also doesn't have any problem punching you or shooting you. Shirley MacLaine's character in the Two Mules for Sister Sarah.
Yeah.
She's a prostitute dressed as a nun.
Yeah.
That kind of goes back to the wife of Bath. Maybe like Nancy from please, sir, I want some more, with Oliver Twist. So you get these like characters that they are like the magician archetype that you talk about, but they're also seems like they're on their own pilgrimage. Since they're by themselves, they're also an orphan. These archetypes really aren't like a reincarnation where you're kind of working through the same one situation over and over until you get it right. These archetypes are kind of like get a whole bunch of different strands all weaved together to create fuller characters.
Yeah.
They aren't flat.
No, certainly not. No. Anything but flat. Yeah. Well, it's the figures you describe here are wonderfully rich and varied, and they are who they are, and they're all of them, as it were, on a journey. They're on a journey from the start of the story until the end of the story, and that usually means that they leave home, or they've already left home, and they're on a bit of a pilgrimage, even if it's a very short pilgrimage. And during that time, they are tested. So, you brought up Nancy from Oliver Twist. Nancy is an orphan, and she's the lover, I guess. She's a prostitute, but she's also the lover of Bill Sikes. And but she, instead of just being a baddie, she becomes, the prostitute with the heart of gold, because she's the one who looks after and takes care, in the sense of young Oliver, and gives her life as a result. So she goes.
And she's basically his mom.
Yeah, she's a mom figure, because he's lost his mom at birth. But her journey is from being an orphan, being a temporary wife to whichever man comes along, which is kind of being adopted, as it were. She becomes a pilgrim. She just dares to do what she sees is right, and in doing that, she becomes the next archetypal phase, again, a warrior lover, someone who is prepared to fight and die for what they believe in. And she does. She believes in right and truth and all the rest of it to a certain extent. She is killed by Bill Sikes, and that is part of what causes the plot to turn, and for Sikes himself to be cornered and to die as a proven murderer. So
she's breaks up the gang.
It breaks up the whole gang. It breaks up everything that Oliver has been stuck in. So she's on her trajectory. Now she's almost a stereotype, the prostitute with a heart of gold, as you say, Shirley MacLaine. She's the manipulative prostitute pretending to be the nun, and Clint Eastwood is trying terribly hard to look after her, to do the right thing. And right at the end, he discovers, she's not a nun after all. Why did I go to all this trouble? Which is comic. But between the two of them, they've been on a journey as well. They've been on a journey where he discovers he can protect people who seem to be vulnerable, and she's discovered that there is a man out there who is perhaps a little more, or a lot more, honorable than all of the men that she's encountered so far. So they learn something about being human, rather than being shut down and saying all men are terrible and all women are, terrible as well. So each of them has gone on you might say, a journey of self-discovery. And these figures appear again and again in literature and storytelling, actually because they're very easy to identify. And so the reader goes, oh, okay, I know who this is. They see a sort of stereotypical figure, and then they enjoy the variations on the theme. It makes it for a very good story. And the very best stories have stereotypical figures who grow and change and who realize something, or who allow us, the audience, to realize something about what's going on. So, we have these 6 archetypes, and I'll just spell them out. They're the innocent, where we all start, the orphan, the person who's looking for a place to be looked after, that's Cinderella, and then everyone goes on a pilgrimage. And some people don't make much of that pilgrimage, but some people change, and they start to act on what they believe. That's Cinderella. She knows she needs to be at that ball. She knows that there is something important happening there. And so she takes a risk and she goes there. And when she is there, she decides after 3 days, not nights, it's always in the daytime because people have to be able to see each other clearly. She decides after 3 days, maybe this young king's son, maybe he's the one for me. And then she steps back and gives him 3 chances to come and find her. He's already chased after her and not captured her, as it were, not apprehended her, but now he comes back to the house 3 times, looking. He gets a chance not to do what his father wants, which is to choose a bride, but to choose the bride he wants. So by being a pilgrim, she gives him the chance to be a pilgrim. And then when he says, this is the true bride, he's making a declaration. He's saying, I don't care that she's covered in ashes, she's dirty, she's not dressed in finery. This is the one I want. That's a really brave statement from a king's son. I mean, really? We've seen this quite recently, of course, where Harry, a king's son, decides to marry Meghan, who is the divorced mother, American, shock horror, American, being married into the English royal family. And, a few years ago, as we knew from Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, that would not have been allowed, as we saw from Princess Margaret, who wanted to marry the divorced Captain Townsend. That would not have been allowed. Instead of which we've moved through the times, and to some extent we've taken in the lessons, which is that here's a young man, Prince Harry, who says, I want this one, and I don't care what you say. And he not only has married her, but he's also gone on to leave the royal family to say, I want my life. Wow. So he's been a pilgrim, and then he's become a warrior lover, a fighter after what he believes in. With Meghan, he will be able to affect more good in the world than he could have done on his own. And so he will be the 5th archetypal stage. He'll be the monarch pairing of king and queen, man and woman supporting each other, or loving partners supporting each other, in that regal sense of making executive decisions and also being compassionate. That's why I love the fact that they're going off to do their thing, and they're going to work for their own money. They're going to work for charities as well to make the world a better place. Wow! And when we're in that place, every so often, by our efforts, we can make magic happen. That is the magician phase. We won't be there all the time, but all of us have the capability to be there a few times in our lives. When operating from the highest version of who we are, we make things change. And that's right there in the Grimm Brothers as well, right there in the very first story, the Frog King. When the Frog King takes away the young princess who has grown up enormously during the course of the story, he takes her away in the carriage. This is the part nobody ever talks about. And they're riding along the carriage, and the coachman is up in front. There are 8 white horses, beautiful white horses. And as they're going along, there's a bang. And the prince says, what's happening? Is the carriage falling to pieces? And Johannes, the carriage driver, who has been the young king's faithful servant all these years, while he's been imprisoned in his frog incarnation, the Johannes says, no, that's okay. It's not the carriage that's falling to pieces. That was the iron band that I had put around my heart to stop it from breaking when you were turned into a frog. He said, now my heart is swelling with joy, and that's the iron band breaking. And you think, whoa, there's a huge symbolic scenario right there. And it happens 3 times, 3 iron bands, bang, break. And you say, that's what happens when you see 2 people a loving couple, loving partners, when you see two people who are really in tune with each other, who are going forward into the world bravely, when you see that, your heart swells. Anybody's heart swells. And when we see that, we are inspired. We're inspired by their example. And when we're inspired, we become the best versions of ourselves. Now, when Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, I'm sure there were lots of people around England and around the world who looked at it and said, this isn't just a royal spectacle, this isn't just Disney, this is inspiring. These are two people who are going to do something. And you know what? I wouldn't mind betting that not just me, but other people, many other people, looked up and said, I admire that. I can be a braver person than I have been too. I can support others to be brave. And that's magic, isn't it? It's not waving a wand, it's the effect of an example on everybody else. So that's the sixth stage of the archetypes, when we can inspire others, and we can. You do it all the time with this radio program. You inspire people to think beyond what is obvious and the colored brochure of what to buy next. You inspire people, and so when they are inspired, you, whether you know it or not at that moment, are working the magic. But you couldn't do that unless you were doing something that you do exceptionally well and prepared to take it out into the world. If you'd stayed at home and never ventured out, none of this conversation couldn't be happening now.
I hope Barbara heard that, and
I hope so too.
She was talking about tripling my salary. So
good.
She hasn't chimed in yet. So
thanks. I will speak for myself on that one. I don't recall saying tripling your salary, Mark.
we still know what the net gain is, but that's all right. But you were just talking about the Frog King, and one of the interesting things about the Grimm Brothers fairy tales is the use of animals to further the story, and we get the probably some of the Esop fable tales have lasted for about 2,000 years in print, because it is an effective teaching tool. You get a couple of the Canterbury Tales that deal with the nun's priest's tale or something with Chanticleer. I'm not surprised I remember that one from 30 years ago. But and you get like Animal Farm, and it really does pull in different ages of reader. You can relate. Okay, what does that horse symbolize in Animal Farm? And more mature readers are digging a little deeper into the pigs, and okay, I see what Orwell's meaning by that. But how are the Grimm brothers using animals in their tales?
Well, roughly the same way that you're describing. And the first thing we have to realize is that when you bring in things like talking animals, you're immediately signaling to anybody who's listening to the tale, you're signaling, this isn't real, but it might just be about something that is real. So it's a wonderful way of opening things up, just as Esop did with all his fables. I mean, he anthropomorphizes the animals a little bit, but he uses them to show that people are like that as well. So if we go to the Frog King, the very first tale in the collection of the Grimm Brothers, so therefore the one that everybody is going to come across first, we have another aspect, because if you were around farm life at any point, but certainly in the year 1800 in Germany, everybody knew what frogs were symbols of. This was because there was still a cult of Mother Holle, who was a figure who was supposed to preside over wells and fountains, and she was her sacred animal was actually the frog. But more important than that dim reference, because most people were professed as Catholics, was the fact that everybody in the countryside knew that frogs started off as frog spawn, that sort of jelly-like white stuff with a little dot in the center, and that these would hatch into little tadpoles who swam in the water and under the water, and gradually they would grow legs, and gradually they would crawl above the water and start to breathe air. And everybody would see this every spring when the frogs laid their spawn, and they would say, "Oh, this is a story about frogs. We know about frogs. Frogs change. They change visibly, more perhaps than any other animal that we know about. I mean, butterflies change, but that happens over an entire season." So looking at a frog, people would go, "Oh, yeah, symbol of change, of course, frogs change." And they would also say to themselves, frogs live in clean water. And if you were around in 1800 in Germany, you cared whether your water was clean or not. If you had a frog in the water, you could be pretty sure, as long as you didn't drink the bit of water with the frog in it, that this was pretty good water. This was okay. When I grew up, my mother was Swiss, I grew up in Switzerland, and the fountains around several of the main squares, because they were this was the way people got their fresh water until comparatively recently. The top of the fountain was for drinking, the bottom was for laundry, and in the middle you could give the animals something to drink. But many of these fountains had little spouting figures of stone or bronze, and quite often they'd be frogs, because this old connection was, frogs, fountains, sacredness of flowing clean water, change and growth. So the Frog King, as soon as people would have heard the idea of frogs, this is a story about change, and sure enough, he does change. He stops being a frog and he changes into a young king. He stops being this rather pesky animal or amphibian and starts to become a person. Similarly with the princess herself, she stops being a spoiled brat, telling the frog, "I'll promise you anything if you get my little golden ball back." And then as soon as she's got the ball back, she changes her mind and runs off. She changes from being a brat to someone who actually has real courage. I mean, she says she knows she's got to have someone in her bed, but it's not going to be some amphibian, and she's outraged by this. She's outraged, as she should be. You could say he's a frog, but you could also say he's a creep. And she doesn't deserve to be in bed with a creep, so she throws him at the wall to kill him. Wow, that's not the action of a weak kid. It's the action of someone who's coming into their own power. And that, of course, because she's in her own power and says, "No, I don't want that. I need a man in my life, a significant other who is a person," that allows him to become. the person he really is, not to be an amphibian. So the complex role of animals here is that often animals know things that we as humans may forget. So occasionally you'll have a faithful horse, or actually several times you'll have a faithful horse. Several times you'll have princes or princesses who meet creatures that are very helpful to them. And what characterizes those young heroes of the stories and heroines of the stories is that they are kind to animals. They do not mistreat them in any way. So there's one particular story where a young man is very hungry, and he's walking out on the street, and he sees a duck, and he grabs the duck and says, "Okay, you're going to be my food." And the duck says, "No, I've got my little ones here. Spare me, and I'll help you later." And he sees another series of animals in the story, and of course, later in the story, they come back to help him. So the sense is there that nature is not just something to be grabbed and consumed, but there is somehow a give and take here between ourselves and nature, and that we must respect that. Now, obviously, that means if you're hungry, you are probably going to trap and kill a duck at some point, but you're not going to just regard it as food. The idea is to regard it as a fellow creature within nature that sometimes has to be eaten and sometimes can be very useful. So this echoes through the stories. Animals aren't just mobile food. They are creatures who have something to contribute, and often that contribution is far beyond what the individual expected. So animals teach kindness, teach reciprocity, and in some ways, teach us what we're feeling in the case of the Frog King. It's really a big question. Yeah.
Yeah, Alan, we're down to about 2 minutes left. I just want to thank you for being such a wonderful guest. I want to highly recommend to the listeners, pick up a copy of Prince's Frogs and Ugly Sisters, The Healing Power of the Grimm Brothers Tales by Dr. Allan G. Hunter. And do you have any public appearances, any other, it's kind of hard at this period, but is there do you have anything coming up where you could plug it, now's the time, or website?
Yes,
go to?
There's my website, ALLANHUNTER.net, ALLAN, ALLANHUNTER.net. I've been doing a COVID diary every day there. Not many public appearances because there's not much happening in the public appearances domain, but I will be teaching a class with Carla Sonheim's online group. That's Sonheim, Carla Sonheim. She teaches art classes particularly, but this class has to do with word and picture, and I'm looking at narrative and how you can use narrative and art together. Yeah, it's just fascinating stuff. In next spring, if all goes well, I'll be teaching with Bay Path University, and again an online class. This is the Narrative Therapies class, and I'm one segment of that. It's a wonderful program where they have a wonderful creative program as well, but this is a graduate class looking at the way narrative and healing are interlinked and ways that this can be used by practitioners, social workers, therapists, anyone who has an interest in this particular healing modality. It's fascinating stuff.
Okay, so we're down to the last couple seconds. Thank you again, and we will see everyone Tuesday.